So, in this third part, I want to talk specifically about the military side of imperialism, armed globalization, and the so-called war on terror. Imperialism is not a very fashionable world word in general circles. In the past 10 years or so, even bourgeois historians and commentators talk somewhat more about empire and imperialism, this and that, than they used to, which is a sign of something, I think. Well, obvious things are in the world. But usually when people talk, particularly when bourgeois commentators talk about imperialism, they mean the political side, the military side. As I think I've explained, for Marxists, that's not the crucial side for us. It's the economic side, the role, the expansion of capital, the control by capital that's essential. This makes it possible to understand, for example, what we mean when we say something like, Venezuela has not definitively broken with imperialism. Lots of people might not understand that. Maduro is Obama's big enemy, right? And they say a lot of things against one another. But the reality of the Venezuelan economy is still of close interlinkage and dependence with the economy of the United States and imperialism generally. So that's what is decisive for us. But understanding how the economic dimension connects to the political dimension, connects to the military dimension, is also crucial for politics. So that's what I want to focus on generally in this part. Claudio Katz, in his reading, says that militarism is a response to and a cause of the disintegration of political state, peripheral states. That is to say, globalization is such an unequal process that it generates increasing inequality, it marginalizes whole parts of the world, and it's therefore a source of big instability. And this stability can take the form of conflicts within states, conflicts between states, and sometimes even the total collapse of states. In a country like Somalia, or in a country like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, at a certain point there was no state. It had become impossible to sustain a state. And in response, imperialism says, well, the international community must intervene to maintain stability. So this is the armed side, the military side of globalization. And within that, the United States, which economically is weaker than it was certainly 60 years ago, or even 30 years ago, is still the central power in the world. The U.S., Madeleine Albright, when she was foreign minister for the United States, called it the indispensable nation, and it still is that in a military sense for imperialism. It is the enforcer of the neoliberal world order in military terms. You can see this. The United States is economically weaker and in crisis, and has therefore been cutting its military budget, but still this year, 39% of total world military spending is made by the United States. It used to be over 50% only a few years ago. Now it's 39%. But still, that means the United States military is 10 times stronger than any other single country in the world. And this is crucial for the United States economy, for what's called the military-industrial complex. And it's crucial for U.S. capital in rivalries that do exist between U.S. capital and other imperialist capitals. Because at a certain point, U.S. capital can say, geopolitically, militarily, other imperialisms are dependent on us, And therefore, you have to make us certain concessions as the price of the protection we provide for the imperialist order as a whole. And in particular, US militarism is crucial for this whole nexus that we talked about, around oil, automobiles, that's central to the US economy. Because the United States, among the rich countries, is not the most dependent on foreign oil. The United States has a certain amount of oil of its own, and now with shale gas and fracking, the United States has even more oil of its own. But Europe and Japan are still very much dependent on oil from the Middle East mainly, and also Venezuela, Nigeria. And it's the United States Navy that makes sure the sea lanes stay open so that the oil gets to Europe and Japan. And therefore, the US capital can extract a price from Europe and Japan for that service to them. But even the United States, it wants to dominate and control military actions of imperialism, but it doesn't want to do it all on its own. So it forms what are called, since George Bush Sr., coalitions of the willing. So the NATO alliance, for example, is a tool of US imperialism to enlist other countries, imperialist countries and non-imperialist countries, in these military tasks under US domination. The United Nations sometimes, particularly for states that have collapsed, that are not of central importance to imperialism, but have got to be stabilized somehow. The UN often plays a role there. But each of these forums has its limitations. In the UN, because Russia and China, with their own specific interests, have a veto on the Security Council. And within NATO, because France particularly, occasionally has interests that diverge from US interests, and therefore it can block NATO acting the way the US wants to. So the US does what it wants, and it chooses the instrument that is appropriate for the particular task. This system of different variable interests was basically formed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after 1991, going back to the first US invasion of Iraq, which was a decisive moment. It was part of the imperialist counteroffensive in the world, because Arab nationalism had been strong, to the point that the US had had difficulty in maintaining any military bases in the Arab region. And the invasion of Iraq gave the US an opportunity to return in force to the Arab region and to establish military facilities in Bahrain, in Qatar, for a time in Iraq, of course. And those troops are still there. The 1991 invasion allowed the US to demonstrate its military supremacy, and it allowed it to establish a network of bases and alliances even greater than its network had been before. So, Central Asia, for example, the former Soviet republics, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, the US moved into that region. Under Obama, this imperialist counteroffensive has come into difficulties in various ways. Of course, you have the economic crisis, which limits the resources that US imperialism has to spend on its military tasks. And you have the changing relationship of economic forces in the world, so that the Chinese military, for example, is somewhat stronger than it used to be. Still a fraction of the size of the US military. Still essentially a regional military force, not a global one. but poses some problems to U.S. imperialism. And most of all, you have the consequences of earlier U.S. military interventions. So you have the consequence of the fact that the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 ended essentially in a defeat, partly for reasons of strategic stupidity. The U.S. ruling class now sees clearly, for example, that the decision to dissolve the Iraqi army and the Ba'athist whole state apparatus after the invasion of Iraq was a mistake, because it left a power vacuum in the Middle East that the United States was not able to fill, and as a result, Iranian influence expanded. And the relative autonomy of the Iraqi regime made it possible for them to insist on the withdrawal of U.S. troops, so that Iraq is not today a reliable base for U.S. imperialism in the Arab region. So you have the Iraqi defeat, you have the quagmire in Afghanistan, as a country that the United States neglected for several years and is not able to stabilize today. And then you have the U.S. and NATO intervention in Libya, which was an attempt to reassert imperial power in the Arab region in the face of these military difficulties and in the face of the Arab revolutions. And that also did not lead to a successfully stabilized Libyan state that is a reliable client of imperialism today. So in all these ways, U.S. imperialism is weakened. And this is a problem for Obama, for the U.S. ruling class, because there are several crucial things at stake. Again, the oil, and the centrality of the oil to the global capitalist economy, and all the geopolitical consequences that has. The need the U.S. has to be dominant in this region. Since the 1960s, the U.S. has relied largely on the state of Israel as a reliable junior partner in the Middle East, and Israel is certainly reliable in the sense that Zionism is the enemy of all popular aspirations and all attempts at independence from imperialism in the Arab region. So in that sense, Israel is an asset for U.S. imperialism, but in another sense, it's a liability, because Israel is so unpopular with the Arab masses that the consistent U.S. support for Israel makes the U.S. unpopular with the Arab masses. And that creates a problem for the U.S. with different regimes in the Arab region. And finally, you have the other key element of U.S. strategy in the Middle East since 2001, which is the whole discourse and approach of the clash of civilizations. And this is a focus on a confrontation with Islamic fundamentalism. Since the collapse of Stalinism, Islamic fundamentalism functions ideologically as the main enemy of the free world. But it's a problem in a region where the vast majority of people are Muslim, and even key U.S. allies are in fact Islamic fundamentalist regimes. The Saudi Kingdom, for example, is the most fundamentalist Islamic regime in the world, and the oldest U.S. ally in the region. So a discourse that talks about Islamic fundamentalism as the great enemy of our civilization creates problems in dealing with key U.S. allies in the region, and creates problems today with the wide range of Islamic political forces not necessarily opposed to imperialism in the region. There are many complicated dynamics with the division among all these forces. So these are all the complications that the U.S. is dealing with in the Middle East. whole process that Gilbert Ashkar has referred to since 2001, since 9/11, as the clash of barbarisms. For a fundamental Marxist understanding of Islamic fundamentalism, I still think the best text is the text that Gilbert Ashkar wrote in the 1980s in response to the Iranian Revolution, the theses on Islamic fundamentalism. They're not included in the reading material, but for anybody who's particularly interested in the topic, I would urge you to read this. It talks about the importance of the petty bourgeoisie in the Islamic world, in the Arab region specifically, as the class base for Islamic fundamentalism in all its different varieties. But it has many different varieties, and that is important to understand. Islamic fundamentalism is portrayed as an enemy of imperialism, but in fact, different strands of Islamic fundamentalism have very different relations to imperialism. Key strands are crucial allies of U.S. imperialism. The Saudi regime, for example, the oldest U.S. ally in the region. And then you have, for example, the Emirate of Qatar, which is also an Islamic fundamentalist regime, also, in the last analysis, very much a part of the imperialist system and an ally of U.S. imperialism, but with some rivalry with the Saudis and a certain amount of autonomy. And the existence of Al Jazeera, the media network, based in Qatar, as a voice for different political forces in the Arab region, symbolizes the autonomy of Qatar and its rivalry with other forces like the Saudis. So that's a complication. On the other extreme, you have a group like Al-Qaeda, which you can't exactly call anti-imperialist because it doesn't have an analysis of imperialism as such. Al-Qaeda is opposed to Zionism, which it fundamentally understands as the Jews, and to what it calls the Crusaders, the presence of Christian powers in the Middle East. But Al-Qaeda is actually quite clear that if all the imperialist powers, the Christian imperialist powers, would withdraw from the Middle East, it would have no problem. So it's not in that sense an imperialist force. Of course, imperialism cannot withdraw from the Middle East. This creates major conflicts between Al-Qaeda and imperialism. And that's on one extreme. And in between, you have all sorts of other Islamic fundamentalist currents that have shifting and varied relationships to imperialism. So within Iran, for example, Islamic fundamentalist currents think perhaps it is possible to make a deal with U.S. imperialism. Since the last presidential in Iraq, that looks somewhat more likely. This has implications for a force like Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is also a shifting force in some ways. So there are all these complicated dynamics in the relationship between Islamic fundamentalism and imperialism. For us, in a certain sense, it's less complicated, because for our comrades on the ground in the Arab region, all strands of Islamic fundamentalism are essentially an enemy. Even the ones that have the most conflicts with imperialism are strongly anti-Marxist, strongly opposed to any working class-based politics, and violent in their responses often to forces of the independent left. To revolutionary Marxist forces, as comrades from the Arab region can tell you. And on fundamental issues like feminism, like LGBT rights, there are very few distinctions to be made among Islamic fundamentalist forces. So in this sense, we have to understand Islamic fundamentalism in general as an adversary, as an ideological adversary. But our tactics have to be complicated and sophisticated, because at times, some Islamic fundamentalist currents are on the same side as we are in a particular conflict. when Hezbollah comes into conflict with the state of Israel, we're on the same side as Hezbollah. And this leads Ashkar to use the old United Front slogan in these cases, march separately, strike together. That is to say, sometimes we have to take aim together against a common enemy, but this never means merging our forces. And this is, or confusing our ideological differences. And this is a hard thing for many left forces in the Arab region to understand, because in countries that are overwhelmingly Muslim, where the assumption is that people in general, workers in general are Muslim, sometimes it's a temptation, even for left forces, to accommodate to Islamic fundamentalism by adopting Islamic rhetoric. And that's deadly. Because any alliance with such forces, even the most anti-imperialist of them, is conjunctural, is temporary, tactical. And you have to be prepared to take your distance. And if you confuse the banners, then you're in trouble, because your own base will not understand when the divisions arise. Now, fundamental question of the Arab revolutions is whether Islamic fundamentalism was sidelined, could be sidelined by the processes. And just in the 2 years of the Arab revolutions, there have been many changes on this front. At first, with the movements in Tunisia, with the young people who gathered on Tahrir Square in Cairo, it was an amazing thing, because Islamic fundamentalism had been central to the politics of the region for so long, and suddenly the central movement for change was one where fundamentalists were not playing a major role. In Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists came late to Tahrir Square and hesitantly, and were not always there for the decisive battles. So suddenly, there was a sense that the triumph of Islamic fundamentalism is not inevitable in this region. Then, in the elections in Tunisia and Egypt, there was the sense of, oh no, it's over. And in fact, the Islamic fundamentalists do have the massive support in society. Our comrades always said that's a superficial reading, and within a matter of a year or two, we see that in fact the Muslim Brotherhood and Ennahda are not as strong as the election results made them seem. That the battle is far from over. So this is a question that remains a fundamental stake in the region. How central the role of Islamic fundamentalism will be. And now to turn to the theory of permanent revolution, which is our strategy for intervening in all these conflicts, in all these social processes. A tricky thing about talking about permanent revolution is that it's a distinctive feature of our own identity as a current, for the Fourth International, as Trotskyists. It's probably identified with Trotskyism more than any other single theory. It's something that enables us in our own way to claim the heritage of the Russian Revolution, because we can say, Stalinists and Maoists disagree, but we can say the fundamental theory behind the Bolshevik victory in Russia was the theory of permanent revolution that Trotsky developed first and that Lenin later came around to. And so we are in continuity with that great historic event. It also enables us to look at the whole period after the Second World War in a different way. Because it was hard for us. Going into the Second World War, Trotsky predicted that the Fourth International, like the Third International after the First World War, would become a mass international quickly and would be leading anti-capitalist revolutions. And that didn't happen. There was no mass breakthrough. Trotskyists didn't take power anywhere. And there were a series of anti-capitalist revolutions in Yugoslavia, in China, in Vietnam, in Cuba, and we didn't lead any of them. But in the Fourth International, we were able to say, well, in a way, the theory of permanent revolution was vindicated by all these anti-capitalist revolutions. These revolutions that had to, in order to win national independence, in order to defeat imperialism, also had to go over into anti-capitalist revolutions, had to break fundamentally with capitalism. So this was very important for us, specifically for the 1968 revolution, in the battle against the Vietnam War, to say these are, in a sense, also revolutions that vindicate our theory. Since 1989, this has been more complicated because there have been no new anti-capitalist revolutions since 1989, and this faces us with different difficulties, but I'll come back to that in a moment. First, to look at the history of the theory of permanent revolution. The theory was developed in the wake of the 1905 revolution in Russia, which was a defeated revolution, but in a sense a dress rehearsal for 1917. And in the 1905 revolution, the basic divide between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks was unfolding. And Trotsky had a third position, different from the Mensheviks or the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks' position was basically to say the Russian Revolution will be a bourgeois revolution, and therefore the position of revolutionary socialists is to let the bourgeoisie win. And to remain in intransigent revolutionary opposition, and to build the working class movement for the next revolution, years later. Lenin and the Bolsheviks said, no, the Russian Revolution will be a bourgeois revolution, but there can be crucial differences in the kind of bourgeois revolution. The agrarian question, for example, can be resolved in a more popular or a more elitist way. The bourgeois state that emerges from the revolution can be democratic or less democratic. And it's crucial for the working class to intervene, and even for a time, perhaps, to take power in order to make the most radical possible bourgeois revolution. And Trotsky alone, within Russian social democracy, said, actually, the Russian Revolution cannot be a bourgeois revolution. Because the bourgeoisie cannot make it, the bourgeoisie is too weak and afraid. Only the working class can make the revolution. And in this way, Trotsky agreed with people like Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, who also thought that the working class would be decisive for the victory of the revolution. But Trotsky went on to say, alone, because the working class will be the leading force, the revolution will have to break with capitalism. And of course, you can't build socialism in Russia, but that means that the Russian Revolution will have to grow into an international revolution more widely in Europe, so that a socialist revolution in Europe is possible that can save the working class revolution in Russia. That was Trotsky's theory. For years, it was a forgotten theory because the 1905 revolution was defeated and the debates didn't seem as relevant. In 1917, the debates returned. And in Lenin's April theses, in April 1917, Lenin totally confused the leading Bolsheviks by abandoning his own theory of the radical bourgeois revolution that would happen in Russia, and said, since February, there is a new task on the agenda in Russia, and this is the overthrow of capitalism. So this made it possible for Trotsky, who was isolated all those years, to join the Bolshevik Party in July 1917, and for Lenin and Trotsky together to lead the October Revolution that overthrew capitalism in Russia. All these debates came back in 1923-24 in the fight over succession to the leadership of the Bolshevik Party with Lenin's death. They had never actually discussed permanent revolution in those years because Lenin and Trotsky came from somewhat different traditions and had used somewhat different terms, and they agreed in practice. The whole leadership of the Bolshevik Party agreed in practice. So people hadn't bothered with the words. But in 1923 and 24, when Trotsky seemed the logical candidate to succeed Lenin after Lenin's death, Stalin and Zinoviev and Kamenev, who wanted to block Trotsky, seized on Trotsky's old debates with Lenin from before 1917 in order to say, Trotsky has never been a real Bolshevik and Trotsky must not be allowed to lead the Bolshevik Party or Soviet Russia. Trotsky didn't raise the issue of permanent revolution. It was his enemies who did. And the debate became a new debate when Stalin put forward the slogan of socialism in one country. If necessary, we can build socialism in Russia in isolation. Something that the Bolsheviks had never said after 1917. And suddenly that became the Bolshevik position, socialism in one country, against the Menshevik Trotskyist position of permanent revolution. For Trotsky, the issue of permanent revolution really became crucial, not in those debates when he said this is ridiculous and it's you people who are just breaking with Lenin's Bolshevism and I'm the one who's true to it. But it became crucial in the course of the Chinese Revolution, because in that revolution, Stalin and Zinoviev and Kamenev and Bukharin applied the theory of stages. They returned to Lenin's pre-1917 theory and said the Chinese Revolution will be a bourgeois revolution in which the working class will be allied not only with the peasantry, but with the petty bourgeoisie and the national bourgeoisie. And that led the Chinese Revolution to disaster, because they relied on the bourgeois leader Chiang Kai-shek, who turned around and massacred the communists in Shanghai in 1927. And in response, Trotsky returned to his old theory of permanent revolution, and for the first time made it a general theory. For the first time he said, there can be no bourgeois democratic revolution in the age of imperialism. Any successful democratic revolution must be led by the working class and must lead to a break with capitalism. And that he only formalized when he wrote his book on permanent revolution in 1929. But if you look carefully at what he wrote then, even then, the way he formulated and generalized the theory of revolution is more flexible and more cautious than many Trotskyists often realize. So if you look at the key points of the theory, and the short summary Trotsky put at the end of his book is in the reading material, there are some key points. One is, he makes very clear, it's not a question of economic maturity that's central for the possibility of revolution. Russia was a backward country, but it was, as Lenin said, the weak link in the imperialist chain. So that made a break with capitalism possible despite its economic backwardness. And that put socialist as the theory is totally opposed to stagism, to the idea that there can be any stage where the capitalist ruling class has been overthrown, but socialist tasks are not yet on the agenda. No, socialist tasks are to some extent on the agenda from the beginning. But that does not at all mean that the working class is the one and only decisive force. This is the caricature that anti-Trotskyists make of Trotskyism, that Trotsky and Trotskyists neglect the peasantry and neglect the petty bourgeoisie. And that's the opposite of the truth. For Trotsky, the question of class alliances was absolutely central. The question of how you build an alliance between the working class and the peasantry was crucial. The question of how you build an alliance between the working class and the petty bourgeoisie was central. How the working class wins the role of the leading class in the revolution. And today, you can look to other allies as well. You can talk about the informal sector, which is crucial in so much of the dependent world. You can talk about youth and students and the crucial role they play in revolutionary processes. So it's not just a question of working class struggle, it's a question of making the alliances, making the connection. Internationalism is crucial to the theory. And this is something that distinguishes our current from all other currents, movements that have made anti-capitalist revolutions since 1945. Because none of them were internationalists in the sense that we are. Capitalism was overthrown in Yugoslavia or Vietnam, but the Yugoslav and Vietnamese regimes did not make much of an attempt to spread anti-capitalist revolutions further. You can say that the Chinese and Cuban regimes have done that at times to some extent, but only to the extent that this was compatible with the interests of their particular regimes, their particular ruling bureaucracies. Revolutionary Marxists like Andreas say, the interests even of a post-capitalist state always have to be subordinated to the interests of the world revolution. It's the interests of the world revolution that come first, and particularly the importance of overthrowing capitalism in its key centers, because that's what will be necessary to build socialism. As long as you only have anti-capitalist revolutions in the poorest 80% of the world, with only 20% of the resources, as the chart said, you cannot build socialism, and therefore the world revolution has to come first. But the theory is not a triumphalist theory. And here particularly, sorry, I forgot to ask if the translators have the reading material, because there's a quotation that's crucial, I think, from what Trotsky wrote. As I said, economic maturity is not the decisive criterion. Political criteria are crucial for the possibility of making a revolution. But that doesn't mean revolution is possible everywhere. So what Trotsky writes is, one second, while the translators. Yes, okay. It's Trotsky on Permanent Revolution. It's point 11. So it's at the very end of the excerpt from Trotsky. And the last paragraph of point 11. Got it? Okay. The last paragraph of point 11 begins. A backward, colonial, or semi-colonial country, the proletariat of which is insufficiently prepared to unite the peasantry and take power, is therefore thereby incapable of bringing the democratic revolution to its conclusion. So what Trotsky is saying here is not the working class is always capable of taking power everywhere. No, he's saying if the working class can't take power, then there can't be a democratic revolution. It's somewhat different. And this is as we will see, is important when we look at a region like the Arab region. Let me just take these last two slides before the break. I included in the reading material a page from Michael Lowy's book on permanent revolution, which talks about the development of the theory since 1945. Michael Lowy is a Latin American comrade from Brazil, for whom the Cuban Revolution and the debates that followed the Cuban Revolution were crucial. So it was important to talk about the Yugoslav, the Chinese, the Vietnamese revolutions, which were bureaucratized revolutions from the beginning, and to talk particularly about the Cuban and Nicaraguan revolutions. Cuba was important as the first anti-capitalist revolution since 1917, whose leadership did not come out of the Stalinized tradition at all, originally. And Nicaragua was unique in some ways, in that in Nicaragua, uniquely since 1917, a single-party bureaucratic dictatorship was never fully established after the revolution. But what I think is particularly interesting in Lowy's report is the countries he talks about where you never had an achieved permanent revolution, you never had an achieved anti-capitalist revolution, but countries like Mexico, Bolivia, and Algeria, where you had what he called interrupted popular revolutions, where the revolutionary dynamic stopped short before capitalism could be fully overthrown. And then Turkey, India, Indonesia, examples for him of what he calls semi-revolutions from above, where there were some major confrontations with imperialism and some major economic changes, but still clearly capitalist states. Just mention these, they're relevant, I think, when we talk about the Arab region, because what these examples show is that mobilization can yield results even if capitalism is not successfully overthrown. There are things that are won in mobilization, even short of total victory. So struggle pays, always. Okay, I will save the last slide of this part for after.